Hi, good evening. I'm Steve Vertovec. I'm the Managing Director of the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity. We're one of the partners in this new initiative, this new center, and we see ourselves as sort of good neighbors. We're on the other side of town a little bit, but we collaborate a lot. And I've been given the charge of chairing this panel. Now we've had the opening speeches, we've had some fantastic music, and now we can start to get into the stuff of trying to think about shaping this global perspective that Andreas was talking to us about. How can we go about doing that? What are the issues at stake? What are the barriers in our way? And we've got a panel of experts from very different countries, very different research contexts, very different fields of research in order to tackle this first question of this panel, which is about challenges of research itself. And yeah, it's very fitting that we have people from very different places, because that's what we need for shaping this global perspective. And we've been given a kind of common task, and this was really nicely laid out by Jelke in her invitation to all of us. And she says that for this panel, she suggests a kind of guiding question could be, against the backdrop of your specific regional and disciplinary expertise, what are to you the challenges of migration research in terms of methodological approaches and context of empirical research, as well as theoretical approaches and analytical concepts? That's no small task, Jelke, but it's really well stated, and sorry, and in 10 minutes each too. But I think that's really well formulated, and each one of our experts has we've kind of shared what they want to talk about in their 10 minutes initial statement, and I think we agree that people are going to be saying very different things, talking about very different topics, and that's good, that's appropriate. We're talking about a complex field, and also I see it as sort of the task of this opening panel to lay out very different themes and topics and challenges that hopefully will be picked up over the next couple of days of many different papers and discussions that are going to go on throughout the conference. So it's good that our speakers will talk about quite different things, but I also hope in the discussion and in the general opening to the floor as well, that we might arrive at a few cross-cutting themes as well and cross-cutting challenges. But as I say, it's good to have diversity of topics and perspectives, and I think that's what we're in for, and I really look forward to it. So let me just say what the kind of organizational way I'm going to carry this out. Each speaker has been asked to talk for 10 minutes to lay out their sort of themes and coming from their specific fields of research. I'll probably ask them, it might be best to speak from the panel. You don't have to, but if they're all nodding, so I think they're comfortable with that. But please, kind of out of the corner of your eye, keep an eye on me, because I'll show you the time signal, and I hope that I don't have to show my little stop sign to anyone as well. I'm sure we won't do that. So 10 minutes each speaker. I think what I'll do, if this is all right with you, sorry we didn't get a chance to arrange this ahead of time, but I suggest after each 10 minutes talk, we can take one, maybe two sort of burning direct questions or comments specifically on that, and then move on to the next speaker, and then we'll have plenty of time to open up the floor and have cross-discussion with the group, if that sounds good to everyone. Yeah. Okay, so let me first introduce Carlos Sandoval Garcia. He's a professor at the Institute of Social Research and School of Media and Communication Studies, where he was also trained as a journalist, both at the University of Costa Rica, and he was also appointed Humboldt professor at the University of Costa Rica. And amongst his publications, recently he published a book, No More Walls, Exclusion and Forced Migration in Central America. Carlos?
like to thank for inviting me to this opening conference for the Center for Global Migration Studies. I'm very pleased to be here. I come from a region where migration is an everyday life challenge. Probably you have noticed the little child from Honduras who became a kind of icon of the separation family moment we are facing in Central America. So I am close to that reality, and from that reality I try to summarize my concerns around 4 main questions that I would like to show with you, trying to not abuse for the time and be on the 10 minutes we thought. So I would like to reflect on, first of all, on why migration has experienced an increase in politicization. Second, I would like to reflect on progressive politics on migration. Third, I will try to address the question of the right not to have to migrate. And the last one is the question of to whom and to what is research on migration a contribution. And we'll try to speak about 2 minutes for each of these. Here you have 2 examples of the ways in which politicization is taking place. On your right, you will notice an example of the crisis in the Mediterranean just 1-2 weeks ago around the ship Aquarius. And on the left, you will notice the kind of things that are appearing during the Trump administration. But perhaps the main issue is that if we compare indicators of migration at the beginning of the 20th century with the figures that we have worldwide at the beginning of the 21st, we will notice that overall rhetoric on migration has increased more than international migration itself. As a previous speaker noticed, talking with people from history is a good resource in order to don't be impressed by current figures. And probably what I find which is new is the ways in which migration is an articulation point of a variety of authoritarian populism. In Eastern Europe, of course, here in Germany, in France, Britain, I think even in Latin America, we have our own version of authoritarian populism. And perhaps the pressing question for me is if we are experiencing a shift from the days of Lady Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, or it is part of the same story. I'm not sure how to respond to the question, but I would like to put that question as a main point of reflection around this first question. The second is trying to manage the pendulum between control and progressive politics, and refers to the issue that most of critical research on migration invests this time around the critique of politics of representations, for instance, around floods and waves, and also the policies in place, such as, for instance, securitization, externalization of borders, and the like. But it seems to me that a main challenge is how to articulate a progressive politics on migration, not only contesting the dominant views on migration politics, but also opening up new ways of thinking. On the ethical domain, I will say that the right to have rights doesn't seem easy to accomplish. I have been following the crisis of the family separation these days, and probably you as well, and we will notice how complicated the issue of migration in real life. And probably in the long run, the key political challenge is how to disentangle belonging to the national state. The third question is regarding the right not to have to migrate. On your left, you have a picture of the train we used to be employed to travel through Mexico, because most of Central American people don't have visa to be officially in Mexico. And on the other side, you have the latest cover of Time, which is circulating today. And she is the little girl who came from Honduras. Overall, I would say, speaking from my experience in Central America, that neoliberal policies have dismantled local economies, and structural violence is more prevalent nowadays. And also, we are experiencing a very strong reality of criminal violence, which is a result of the increase of narcotics circulating through the region. Last year, as part of the Humboldt Chair at the University of Costa Rica, it was carried out a survey in five communities in each of the capitals of Central America, and 50% of the young people who surveyed responded that they would be happy leaving their countries. Half of the survey said we will be happy if we could go to another country. So the structural dimension of dispossession makes a forced migration as a very, very complex issue for us in the region. And the last question is regards with the ways in which migration research is organized. Just to say some few words in the last 2 minutes, I would say that an important challenge is how to share knowledge with the migrant communities themselves, and the issue of advocacy and working with the communities is a very important challenge. Another one is the ways in which we translate research funding into the public sphere and policy making. And overall, I would claim for a less inward academic culture, and more, so to speak, a more public social science we need these days. And since I am approaching the end, I would like to thank for this first 10 minutes. Thank you.
Excellent. Many thanks, Carlos. I mean, really, yeah, great start laying out issues of the context at this juncture right now in which migration research is being done. Hopefully that's a thing we can come back to. And also how our work might, well, I think that's a great notion about contributing to migrant communities themselves as well as advocacy groups. As I said, I'll open it up for one, maximum two very succinct questions or statements people might have directly stemming from all this talk. In the back there, please. And I don't know if we've got any roaming mics or you just have to shout it out. Oh, there we are, yeah. So,
good afternoon. My name is Jamina Hugo. I'm a PhD student at the University of Göttingen in political science. Thank you so much for your talk. I was really intrigued by the attention that you drew to migration as kind of a locus for political discussions today. And you said also that there's a special kind of rhetoric that seems to be coming out of authoritarian populist governments, but they don't all have the same migration situation. As I'm sure you know, some are sending people and some are receiving migrants. Would you say that there is a similar logic in the way these governments talk about migration, whether they're sending or receiving countries, or would you say that the situation also makes the discourse different?
Yeah, thanks for your question. Well, when I mention authoritarian populism, I'm thinking mainly about the receiving countries, the governments in the receiving countries. And within them, of course, there are a number of differences. But overall, I would say that this articulation between authoritarianism and populism could be a way of thinking about why migration is at the center of the right and the right-wing politics nowadays.
Okay, well, save up your questions then, because we'll have plenty of time at the end for general. Let's move straight to Georges Fouron, originally from Haiti, is currently professor of education and social sciences at the State University of New York, Stony Brook. He graduated from University of Haiti in International Affairs. It's got the year here, George, but I'll keep that state secret, as well as degrees from University of the West Indies and from Columbia as well. His research endeavors focus on transnationalism and its effect as experienced by Haitians in Haiti and those of the Haitian diaspora. And amongst his most recent books is Footsteps of Migration, Caribbean Immigrants, and U.S. Racial Taxonomy. George.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. To begin, I want to thank the organizers of the conference who have invited me, and I'll do my best not to let them down. I am originally from Haiti, and I've been living in America for close to 50 years now. Now you know my age. My deepest, my most traumatic time during my stay in the United States was in the 1980s, at the beginning of the AIDS crisis. At the beginning, the AIDS crisis was identified as a gay disease. People who were heterosexual did not care about the gay problem if they didn't have gay sex. And then there was a phenomenon that happened, what we call the boat people. There was a song about the boat people I was interested in that, but I couldn't understand the words. At any rate, when the boat people came from Haiti during the dictatorship of Duvalier, who was being supported by the American government because of fear of communism in the region, many Haitians left Haiti in boats without legal documents to try to get into the United States for a change and for hope of a better future. At that time, I had begun my teaching at the University of Stony Brook, and because of that fear of contracting AIDS, hospitals, and especially the hospital at my university, was short of blood. People were afraid of giving blood. So the president of the university sent a notice to the campus to volunteer to give blood, both staff, faculty, and students. And when I read the notice, I didn't think anything about it. I said, well, that's a great endeavor because we have a hospital, they don't have blood. We should give blood. I proceeded to the center where blood was being accepted. And as I stood online, one of the screeners was a former student of mine. She recognized me and she was very happy that I took the initiative to give blood. But at that time, when you give blood, you have to give your particulars, your place of birth, your name, any disease you may have, if you've been tested for AIDS. And then she gave me the card and I filled it out. He asked, where were you born? I said, Haiti. And when I gave her the card, she looked at me. She said, Professor Fouron, I'm just so sorry, but you can't give blood. I said, why not? Because you are Haitian. I said, no, I'm not a Haitian citizen. I'm an American citizen. I have an American passport. I have been a professor at this university for so many years. I have not lived in Haiti for so many decades. How can you say that I'm a Haitian? I am an American. She said to me, no, Professor Fouron, you're not an American. You are a Haitian. And that led me to write an article about the question of citizenship that was published in the journal Identities, if you can get access to it and read it. So that made me concerned about the concept of identity in the age of globalization, glocalization, transnational migration, and multiculturalism. We all know that at the beginning, the question of citizenship was restricted, and of course there were discriminatory, and there are still discriminatory rules about who are entitled to the benefits and identification with the nation, and those who are not entitled. As an immigrant, having migrated to America, and having taken the oath of citizenship, which by the way required me to renounce to my former nationality, and finding myself in a situation when I wanted to help my country that I identify with, I was told I am not what I thought I was. So what does it mean to be a citizen in the age of globalization, glocalization, transnational migration, and multiculturalism? Is it an illusion? Is it a reality? For that reason, many immigrants have adopted different types of identity, among them cultural identity, social identity, transnational identity. Of course, in the discussions we can address them. Not only that, we have international organizations such as the African Union that took a resolution in the year 2000 declaring that the question of nationality and citizenship, referring to a bounded political identity, its time has come. People are deserving of rights, whether or not they are citizens, or whether or not they are living without papers, or whatever the circumstances. In 2005, the United Nations took a resolution, the AU took the resolution to say that the question of non-interference in the in the affairs of state should be replaced by the concept of non-indifference. You cannot remain indifferent if people are being denied their rights, are being persecuted, either in the country of origin, in another country, and the community, the international community, has an obligation to intervene. In 2005, the UN took a resolution that it's called Responsibility to Protect, the R2P. And it requires nation states to intervene in the affairs of independent nation states when they do not observe or they do not apply all the rules and regulations pertaining to the rights of individuals, the right to have rights. Lastly, the reaction of the immigrants themselves who find themselves in situations where they are denied the full rights of citizenship to adopt what we refer in the literature as transnational identity, living their lives in more than two societies at the same time. We call that an exit strategy when they face hegemonic treatment by the host nation and sometimes by their native land as well, because there are a lot of persecutions that take place in the native land of the individuals on the basis of religion, on the basis of political ideas, on the basis of socioeconomic realities and the like. So we are living in a world today whereas globalization was supposed to create a flat world, meaning to say that the playing field was supposed to have been leveled. And on the question of citizenship, we see that some citizenships have value, others do not have value. And there is an index of citizenship that publishes every year the value of citizenship in specific countries around the world. If you are a German citizen, to take an example, you can go into any country at any time without any problem. But if you are a member of a citizen of a third world country, it is almost impossible in certain circumstances to get a visa, to travel as a person with dignity and respect. So therefore, my presentation deals with the question of citizenship, the necessities for nation states, for the citizens to look with critical eyes about the predicament of the outsiders when they enter a particular country. Although they have the intention to be part of those societies, very often they face jingoistic, nationalistic reaction that make them feel less like an individual, like a person. So therefore, as an exit strategy, they practice what we refer to transnationalism, not being embedded in any society at the exclusion of all others. They make a choice of living in more than one country and one society at the same time. Thank you very much.
Excellent, George. Thanks very much. I mean, importantly, getting on the table, which I hope issues, again, we'll continue to talk about for the next couple of days. Identity, citizenship, belonging, but especially, I mean, your opening scenario, this kind of, how else to put it, a kind of perpetual otherness. No matter what one does, some people will still always read as the other. Yeah. Questions?
I have 1.5 questions. So one is when thinking about how this, what Steve called perpetual otherness stays even when one has adopted citizenship, I was wondering while you're speaking, this is not the same it depends on the country where we come from. So not just the formal value of citizenship where we can travel, but also the possibility to become another citizen seems to be very stratified along the different nationalities. And the one on the half question I also have is, in the meantime, have there been court cases challenging these discrimination questions of blood donation? Because this seems very hard to justify to me under legal
Yes, there have been, in my case, in the case of Haitians who were considered to be contaminated with the AIDS virus a priori by the American government, there was a law case that ruled against the federal government for having listed Haitians as a nationality and ethnic group in America, causing harm to the American population on the question of bringing the AIDS virus to America, when in fact it was not that at all. And after the court case, there was a big march in New York City on April the 20th, 1990, whereby Haitians and their allies, Americans, white, black, Asian, say, you can't do that to a people. It's not fair. And they rescinded it. But we still can give blood, mind you. Like the homosexuals, we can give blood. Even if you are an American citizen, you were Haitians, you can't give blood. What does that do to you for your identity? Am I an American? I did renounce my Haitian nationality, and they tell me I'm not an American. What am I? In this global universe, where the world was supposed to be flat, to quote Friedman, the world is not flat at all.
Well, and on that note too, do you want to just Donna's issue about what we kind of stratified ability to even gain citizenships and so forth?
Well, for the United States, the question, you can get citizenship 3 ways. Through you solely, if you have a child born in America. Through you sanguine, if you're an American citizen, your blood is American, quote unquote. So your child inherits your blood, and of course is an American. Or you can get it through naturalization, like in my case. Now the Republican Party wants to amend the American Constitution to invalidate the 14th Amendment that gives immigrants, whether legal or illegal, immigrant children who are born in America to become citizens. Now, what they want to do is to amend the Constitution. If you are an undocumented immigrant, you give birth to a child in America, that child will not be an American. That child will not be an American. And they are beginning the process of amending the Constitution. Probably they will not be successful. But the idea of excluding people based on status or based on place of origin, place on race, is repulsive in a democracy. And that's the trend they are trying to take right now. And they never contemplated that idea. The 14th Amendment was passed in 1870. And we are in 2000, and all of a sudden they discover that children of undocumented immigrants born in America are American citizens. They say that should not be. So what is citizenship? What does it mean when someone says, I'm a citizen of country A, citizen of country B? Or when you change your citizenship, adopt a country that you migrate to, and face the reality where they tell you, no matter what you think, I don't consider you an American. And yet I have an American passport, and I have it right here with me. So what does that mean to me? Having that passport with me, traveling with that passport, teaching at a major university, representing America through my research, but yet I'm not an American in the eyes of many. What does that mean to be a citizen? Thank you.
I had seen another question there, but if you could hold your question to the open round. Let's move to Mulki Al-Sharmani, who's an anthropologist and has acted as coordinator of the Global Life Stories Project as part of a collaborative research she's been doing since 2013 under Academy of Finland Research Fellowship. And she's based at the Faculty of Theology, University of Helsinki, and one of her recent books is Men in Charge, ? Rethinking Authority in Muslim Legal Tradition.
Thank you. I want to, first of all, good evening to all of you, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I want to congratulate you on birthing of this very important center and wish you the best of luck. And I thank the audience for the interest. Now, this presentation, I'm calling it Revisiting the Anthropology of Islam and Contemporary Muslims, Relevance to Migration Studies, ? And so I want to make two central points, and I always run out of time. I probably will stay with the first point, but maybe in the discussion, I will invite you to ask me about the second point if I run out of time. So this new recent refugee crisis, has unmasked again this European panic against a perceived invasion of a Muslim other, seen as markedly different and antithetical to a European Christian identity. And we've seen also, of course, abundant examples of anti-Islam, anti-Muslim hysteria from multiple voices. So this recent wave of Islamophobia heightened again the politicization and contestation of Islam and contemporary Muslims in Europe. But what do we do with moments like this? What can we learn from them, specifically in terms of concepts and methodologies that we could use to research Islam and contemporary Muslims in relation to migration studies? So that will be the focus of my reflection. So the first point that I want to make, and it's a bit of a controversial point, I want to think aloud with you. I want to revisit this binary of textual, organized, institutional, visible, monolithic Islam versus the lived, everyday, invisible, fluid, plural, dynamic Islam. And I want to argue instead for an integrated approach that combines textual and lived Islam. This part might be controversial, theology and everyday life. And this approach, in my mind, entails that we study how Islamic norms come into being and are continually and dynamically given meaning through the lived experiences and practices of Muslims, and how religious meaning-making develop and shift in the lived experiences of Muslims at different life junctures in different contexts. And I situate my reflections in an existing debate in the intersecting fields of Islamic studies, migration studies, and religious studies. And this debate goes like this. You know, the overlap, the central question has been, you know, has Islam dominated as a singular explanatory paradigm for the life worlds of contemporary Muslims, whether in Europe or in Muslim majority? And which Muslims are being studied, which ones are not being studied, and what are the assumptions about how we choose which ones to study? And then there's been this call for, let's shift to a studying of lived Islam, or more precisely, the lived realities of Muslim lives, you know? And I ask, can an integrated approach offer a way forward? Because I think this debate is very important and much needed, but I feel that it hasn't entirely escaped the binary of Islam versus Muslim lived reality. So one Finnish anthropologist, very important person, scholar who has been a vocal voice in this debate is Samuel Shield, and he correctly, I agree with him, argues against this methodological and conceptual approach that sees Islam as fixed, as external entity outside Muslim lives, and an all-encompassing normative framework that explains everything about Muslims. And he takes issue with a focus on so-called pious Muslims and particular kinds of domains and practices that are seen as religious, with the exclusion of others. For example, focus on mosques, on donning hijab, beard, fasting, and so on, joining faith-based groups, being a Salafi, being a member of an Islamicist group. And he particularly also critiques the concept of Islam as a discursive tradition put forward by Talal Asad and adopted by numerous anthropologists studying Muslim religious and ethical lives, both in diaspora and in Muslim majority context. And he calls for turning the ethnographic gaze to ambiguities and the contingencies and the aspirations and the practices of everyday lives of Muslims, and how they navigate multiple norms, not just confined to Islam. And he, in fact, says instead of norms, he proposes this concept of grand schemes. And so his project is about let's de-exceptionalize and let's de-center Islam, let's not privilege Islam, but instead privilege lived realities of Muslims in diverse contexts. And there are others who've been calling for this approach, and for them it has been about how we can highlight through this approach resistance, departure and resistance of everyday Muslims to authoritative norms, and how to show the multiple forms of Muslim agency. And I agree that there are conceptual and methodological limits to approaching Islam as a singular, all-encompassing framework. I also agree that we need to revisit this category of the pious Muslim in the sense of revisit who do we study, what do we study, and I would add for how long we study. But I still see a significant gap in this everyday life approach. I feel what is missing is that paying ethnographic attention to the interplay between norms and practices. And lived experiences, between theology and everyday life. So in this everyday life approach, I feel there's attention paid to the contingencies, to the ambiguities of everyday life, to the fluidities, which is well and good and much needed. But I feel that Islamic norms are often assumed to be given and fixed. What we also need to study, I'm proposing, is how these norms come into being and are continually and dynamically made sense of anew by Muslims in their lived realities, and I can give you an example in the discussion. So we need to study, to be more specific, what modes of religious arguments and non-religious arguments and reasoning people use, what religious and non-religious understandings they develop or walk away from, discard, as they work out how Islamic norms, as well as other norms that are relevant to their lives, inform their practices, their anxieties, their aspirations, their affects, and vice versa, how the circumstances of their lived realities shape their understandings of these norms. And I disagree with Shilk. I think it's still relevant and meaningful to talk about Islam as a discursive textual tradition, but I would add it's important not to see this tradition as free-floating entity, but a system of meanings that comes into being, is understood, is debated, is changed in the context of lived realities. So I'm proposing an integrated ethnographically based approach that pays attention to both textual and lived Islam. Now, there are possible pitfalls for this approach that I'm toying with, and advantages. Now, let me start with the pitfalls. So, is this approach calling for more focus on theology? And remember, I started my presentation with saying with this heightened panic about Islam and Muslims and invasion of Muslims. So, do we really need more focus on theology again? And the answer, I would say, is yes, partly yes. But one could counter-argue and say, well, paying attention to Islamic theology in studies about Muslim migrants could contribute again to the perennial problem of essentializing and exceptionalizing Islam. It could have the unintended but serious political risks at these current times when Islamophobia is heightened. And these, I would say, are very valid concerns that we need to think about and perhaps we can discuss. But my answer would be, what I'm proposing is not to privilege theology or textual Islam at the expense of the lived realities of diasporic Muslims who are diverse. Rather, what I'm calling for is a kind of a multidisciplinary research that not only focuses on what Muslims do or don't do, how Western states accommodate or don't accommodate Muslim religious needs, but a kind of research that also examines up and close how Islamic theology takes shape, is debated, is contested, is reinterpreted, and perhaps discarded in the diverse and concrete way, in the practices of daily Muslims, their practices, their life choices, the ways in which they give meaning to this theology, the modes of reasoning they use, the understandings they formulate. And I'm also calling for a close study of how Muslims make sense of Islamic norms in relation to or in opposition to the other norms that they find are relevant to their lives. So I'm calling for an approach that pays attention to theology and everyday life and their complex but real, I think, connections. Now, a counter-argument could be that, how are we doing? 2 minutes, yeah. A counter-argument could be that wouldn't this kind of approach again lead us back to focusing on pious Muslims? One more, because, well, what about those Muslims that don't care about this theology, don't care about Islamic norms, are indifferent to it, or don't live by it? Okay, here's my answer. First of all, perhaps this approach, what it can offer in the case, let's start with the so-called visible pious Muslim. What it can do for us is that it can help us not understand the relationship with the tradition in a very static and non-changing way, but to sort of pay attention to how that changes and the shifts that happens. Another thing that through this approach that we can do is, in the case of Muslims who are indifferent to the tradition or walk away from it, understand the choices and the life worlds of these Muslims and understand how and why Islamic norms are problematic or irrelevant to these Muslims. Now there's my second point had to do with, again, the relationship between diasporic Muslims and Islamic interpretive tradition in relation to gender, but I can talk about that in the discussion. How am I doing? Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Mulki. Well, I'm an anthropologist as well, so everything you said was just music to my ears. It was great, because I could completely agree. But let me open the first question. I'll still take one or two direct questions for Mulki before we open up for a general discussion or for further questions to the other panelists. I think you make a great case for this, differentiating and focusing on everyday lived fluidity and so forth, vis-a-vis a kind of textual, formulated Islam and so forth. But, I mean, let's face it, going back to the kind of context that we're in right now, if it's a valid notion, how does this relate to imagined Islam? And what I mean by that is in the current discourse, and I'll give a specific example, which you might have heard about. It's just a couple of months ago, no less than the interior minister in Germany, Seehofer, said Islam does not belong to Germany. And that triggered lots of public debate, but a lot of journalists ran around and suddenly started picking apart, well, maybe some kinds do, and they started looking at Milli Gurush and Sufi forms and so forth as a way of finding, well, maybe there is a type of Islam that fits, but there was some work actually that tried to get towards what you're arguing with the everyday, you know, looking for Muslims who have flags or support the German football team or something like that. It wasn't, you know, quite as kind of deep as you were meaning, but I think those attempts were missing the point that what Seehofer was pointing out is, you know, by way of, I would call it an imagined Islam, is again a kind of perpetual otherness. It will never fit. This thing, no matter what form, no matter what everyday fluid thing, there's something that won't fit. And how do you fit that in with what we can study, and how the people living these fluid lives and multiple norms? I mean, it's a fantastic set of ideas, tools to look at things. How can we study that vis-a-vis this kind of imagined Islam that's out there in the public sphere?
Thank you. I think there are a couple of ways to unpack this, and just to give another context that is relevant, and perhaps some of you have heard of it. Now, very recently, also the Minister of Justice in Finland made a statement saying that Sharia doesn't belong in Finland, and invoking the usual images of Sharia, meaning forced marriage, child marriage, and so on. It happened very recently, just a few weeks ago, and then a colleague of mine and myself, we penned an editorial and published it in the main newspaper in Finland, engaging with that. And it just happened to be that we were hosting in the University of Helsinki the Islamic Legal Studies, the Islamic Legal Studies Society's 3-year conference. And we had, I don't know if some of you are familiar with one of the American scholars who work on Islamic law, Asifa Qureshi, who edited this book on Islamic marriage contract with Frank Vogel. And she has this very famous article called "Who is Afraid of Sharia Law?" You know, after "Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf," right? And I would say, this is a long way, but again, to add context to it, but I would say we need to approach this on different levels. So what you are pointing to is on the level of the public discourse, and that's very relevant. And in and in that level, what I'm calling for is risky, but perhaps what we tend to do, and we hear, I think maybe what researchers presenting our findings, and I'm generalizing, sorry if I am, it's wrong, you know, but in general, there's this really downplaying theology, and of course Muslims, like everybody else, Muslims are very diverse, but I would say perhaps more engaging is to engage with theology, living theology, what it means to Muslims, but theology also as a norm in addition to other norms. So for example, Sharia. Sharia now in modern times, often in these public discourse, is understood as simply law. Right? And not only that, law associated with the hudud law in Islamic jurisprudence, i.e. cutting limbs, stoning and that. But does Sharia mean that, first of all, in the tradition itself, and Wa'il Halaq has wonderful work on that, but also what does Sharia actually mean for diverse Muslims? For some it might mean that, it might mean something else. What does it mean? We need to tackle that, So, and I'm aware of the risks of but what I'm saying is that it's either saying lived Islam in the sense that Muslims are diverse, in fact, most Muslims are not practicing or are practicing in different ways. There are those, but why not also understand how the theology itself in the Muslim lives is evolving? There's living theology. That, I think, we get more about the textual Islam as it is lived, as well as diverse Muslim lives. That's where I'm going with this.
Okay, well, let me ask, because we're set up in kind of talk show format here, although that's not necessarily a good thing in Germany these days. There was actually a call to ban all talk shows for a year because they became so polarized. And there was no constructive dialogue taking place in them. But anyways, there's still plenty there. Anyways,
may I have something?
Yeah, please.
Also, I want to, on the question of citizenship, I wanted to add something else. Even native-born individuals who think that they do not come from another place, they have been a citizen of this country, of a specific country for a number of years, so therefore the citizenship is secure. And I am inviting you to think about it because there is no guarantee that the government, any government, may decide at a point in time certain groups of individuals who have been in this country for a long time do not deserve that citizenship, and we're going to take it away from them. I think I present a case with President Trump that happened a month or two ago, or 3 months ago, relating to the football players, the black football players who refused to stand when the national anthem is being sung. And he proposed not only to fire them, a right that the Constitution of the United States gives them, the First Amendment, the right to protest, the right to free speech. He said not only they should be fired, but also we should expel them from the country. And these people who have been here in America since the beginning of the slave trade, and yet he's questioning their citizenship, advocating getting them out of the country altogether. So it is not only the immigrants whose situation happens to be precarious, but the native-born citizens, and there are many examples in history of deliberately, a priori, governments decided to take away the citizenship of people. We have the situation in Myanmar right now, where the Rohingyas are not given citizenship. And yet they've been living in that country for 10, 15 generations. You have in China populations who are not given citizenship because of their ethnic so therefore my clarification is that it's not only the immigrants who became citizens of specific countries who may not consider to be true citizens of this country, but people who have a long history of citizenship may face a situation at a point in time when the government may decide you don't deserve that citizenship for whatever reason, and I'm going to take it away from you. Thank you.
Yeah. So I wanted to throw out there two comments, one in response to Professor George about the citizenship, and to draw on some work that I've done, and other colleagues have done this too, how the limits of this legal citizenship that you very eloquently explained tonight, and how people who experience this differentiated and racialized citizenship try to navigate that through transnational parenting and family care. And we know a lot of literature about that. In my work, I've done a lot about how you take your kids from Canada to Egypt to make sure that they can escape police violence, they can escape discrimination, and then go back so that they have a chance at a better life. So what I find interesting in these kinds of transnational practices is that on the one hand, this passport, the legal passport, becomes form of a capital, a social capital, precisely because you are Canadian, although you are a Canadian of a lower level, you are able to go to Egypt, or you are able to go to somewhere else and provide your children with resources that will enable them perhaps to go back to Canada and have a better life. So I found that very interesting.
The paradox is that although I was denied that I was an American by an individual who is not a member of the government, but who received the order from the government, so that was a person who was an agent of the government, but the government did not initiate a movement to take the citizenship of Americans who are of Haitian origin. They have not yet done it. But my point is, eventually that may happen. My children, my grandchildren, who don't know any other country but America, may face a situation later on in America where they may tell them officially by the government, go back where you came from, you're not an American. It is possible. And that's why the immigrants have that transnational approach where they're not connected exclusively with any political system, right? They transcend borders and they live their lives as if they were present in those societies. And in return, these countries are extending double citizenship, double nationality to the expatriates living abroad. But most countries do not recognize that strategy. But more and more countries are extending double citizenship and nationalities, giving the immigrants or people who are connected to them an exit strategy from oppression. And we call that an exit strategy. But the problem for the African Americans in America, they cannot have an exit strategy. They are stuck. And when Trump said, maybe they don't belong in the country, where are you going to send them? Africa? Where in Africa? We don't know. But he said it in public. They don't belong here. We got to get rid of them. And there are people who've been living in America since the 1600s.
Well, now that unfortunately we've raised the specter of Trump, I want to come back to it's some issues that Carlos raised right at the very beginning, and that is, we are conducting research. And coming back to the theme of the roundtable, challenges of research. We are conducting research these days in an atmosphere, a public sphere atmosphere, that is different than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and more. So I want to ask each of you a kind of two-part question. How do you see the current atmosphere, milieu, poisonous milieu, as affecting research itself, research strategies? And the more difficult question, which frankly I'm asking you because I don't know the answer myself, I'm trying to figure it out. What is the role of the researcher in light of that public sphere? Yeah, let's put it that way. Carlos, you want to start?
Yeah, well, I don't have answer either, but perhaps I would like to say that, yeah, we are living in very pressing times. So I agree with you when you mentioned it, that perhaps we still need to analyze how hegemonic discourses are gaining more and more prevalent positions in the public sphere, even though I agree with you that we need also ethnography and more everyday life kind of things. But everyday life is important, but I think at the same time, and vice versa, is not enough. And while I was listening to both of you, I was thinking also that probably one of the main remaining questions in these pressing times is if there is any other way of imagining other ways of thinking beyond the national state. Because for me, yeah, I agree that there are similarities between African Americans and migrants, but at the end of the day, the main question is that the national state is the institution around which rights are organized. And if we think that most of modern states have only 2 centuries, we may think, well, it is something beyond the national state, or it is that the national state, even despite globalization and the eroding of economic boundaries, is going to be the main way of organizing territories. I don't know. I dream with the possibility of having other ways of political organization between the national state, but most of our examples come from the national state and the ways in which criminalization is organized. So this is another question.
In my case, I believe that as researchers, as thinkers, we need to stir the pot. We need to let these issues out, and we need to air them out for people to hear them. Because the world cannot continue to go this way, where people are considered, some people are considered to be superior or better than others. We have the international framework. I mentioned the AU, the African Union, that passed a resolution. The non-intervention principle of the Westphalian concept of the nation state should be abandoned, and we should have the concept of non-indifference. When we see a population being brutalized by its own government or by other government, the international community has a responsibility to intervene, regardless of how the nation into which they intervene. They may yell and scream, "This is my, you are invading my space and you are infringing upon my right." And also the 2005 UN resolution, the right to protect, the R2 peak concept. Now the problem is, there are some situations, such as the powerful nation states, the global north, when they brutalize their own people, there is no will and there is no way for the international community to intervene, because they are the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Whatever they say goes. So therefore, when Trump decided African Americans to protest because they are being killed by white police officers for no reason at all, and the Constitution gives them that right to protest, to say you don't belong here, then the international community should stand as one and say, Trump, you're wrong. Like they did it for the young kids. You saw that the Pope spoke about it, the Prime Minister of Great Britain spoke about it, and yesterday he signed a resolution to end the practice. So therefore, there are those possibilities for us researchers and thinkers to stir the pot a little bit, not be afraid to speak out, to point out to the community, international community, what is going on, raise the consciousness of people, and make them take position vis-a-vis these situations. The Rwanda situation should not repeat. The Srebrenica situation should not repeat. And of course, we can go back to a number of horrible things we do to people. They should not repeat themselves. And we, as members of the international community, we have a responsibility to intervene, to speak out, to organize, to stir the pot, and to tell them, we will not in my name, you're not going to do that.
So I will try to address your, I think it's got, thank you, questions from the perspective of what I work on. And I work on, for example, for the past 5 years, I've been working on these transnational Muslim marriage practices and also Muslim women's engagements with the textual tradition. And in my experience, I've had the chance to work in Muslim majority contexts like Egypt, as well as in European contexts. And I think there are several ways to address this. First of all, I think we need to be aware that we can intervene at different levels, not one level. So there's the legal level, there's the engagement with the state level, there's the public discourse, but there's also the level of educating people, right? But then also to be aware as researchers of our limitations. And I want to share some with you. For example, I'm trained as an anthropologist, I do long-term research, ethnographic, which takes a lot of time, which also means trying to get lots of funding so that you can do work for a long time.
Of research.
Right. But then when I translate this into public, and let's share our challenges, I often find myself like when I try to engage with journalists and things like that, and tell them, educate them, even if, okay, there won't be a legal reform and maybe I won't change the state, but at least educate people. Sometimes people, you have to transfer this knowledge. How do you do it in terms that are accessible, but at the same time, we as researchers, and particularly anthropologists, we want to contextualize everything and to try to emphasize this. It's complex. It's not only one level. Please don't reduce this. And I face that. So when I engage with journalists and I try to tell them what I found, I have that challenge, and I'd like to hear from the audience how you deal with that. How do you communicate something that is meaningful, that perhaps ordinary people, and I find that very important. If ordinary people learn something and go out and say, yeah, okay, this is different. I used to understand this in a different way. I think that is a change. That is a change, you know. So, so recognizing our limitations, and perhaps this calls for maybe working with different approaches in our research, visual approaches, you know. What you're doing, like, it's amazing. I wish I could do that, like a documentary and not just art, because there are methods that are much more visual and can speak to people more than just writing articles or giving lectures or roundtable discussions. So these are the things.
Oh, this is very good points. I've said many times that's one of the reasons why both politicians and journalists usually don't like us academics, because we always say it's complicated, it's complex, and so forth. And yeah, we need to find our ways of communicating better and looking at our own limitations. Let me open it up for questions. We've got 15 minutes, or indeed, if anyone themselves wants to take a stab at the question, what is our role in this atmosphere, this setting that we're in right now?
Thank you very much. My question is to Professor Garcia. Is that you mentioned about, in one of your slides, about progressive politics, about migration. So can you tell about what you mean by progressive politics there, and what do you want to see in that politics?
Well, thanks for the question. Yeah, I think that we have more abilities in the critique of dominant views on migration and less capabilities in terms of framing other ways of making public policy regarding migration. And by progressive, I mean a broader umbrella of rights and opportunities for migrant communities in the receiving countries. How to go more specific depends on particular context. But I would say that we need to consider that as a part of the progressive politics of migration implies, for instance, the recognition that most of countries which are now hardening their own policies on migration have been historically expelling their own populations. Now, I was thinking, for instance, in the case of Italy, whose right-wing parties are hardening the entrance of migrants through the Mediterranean. And they forgot that after the Second World War, millions of Italians left Italy and went to Latin America, especially to Argentina. So the nation who expel their population is now telling us what migration means. So I would say that a progressive views on politics needs to take into account history as a kind of starting point. Ironically also, Italy was one of the latest nation states in Europe. They used to say that when they created Italy, now they needed to create Italians because they didn't speak a common language, and now they are quite sure of what Italianness means, so to speak. So I think, since the question is quite complex, I would say that history is the starting point. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question to Dr. Al-Sharmani. With this idea of bringing theology back or into research, which I think is an interesting way of looking at Islam and Muslims differently, I was wondering how would this translate into the public outreach of research? What would be the implications of looking at lived theology for example, the education of journalists or the wider public? How would this change lead to transformations beyond academia, so to say?
That's a very good question. Thank you for it. I'll give you a very concrete example from my research. So, for example, one of the interlocutors that I've been interviewing and working with for over a number of years, and sort of like trying to understand her lived realities, how she makes sense of Islamic norms, and she's a Finnish national of immigrant background. And it was interesting to look, for example, over her life trajectories. This is someone now in her mid-30s, how her understanding of polygamy theologically shifted and changed, and the theological arguments that she used, because of also the diverse sources of religious knowledge that has become available now, and not only in diaspora but also Muslim majority, to people, to those who are traditionally not the gatekeepers of religious of the tradition, right? And so, and because she has that education now, that religious learning, she is able to prioritize certain theological doctrines, and reached a point where she realized, she makes this argument that I'm not accepting polygamy, and she made use of a right in Islamic jurisprudence that where men and women, when they get married, they can insert stipulations in their marriage contract. She negotiated for monogamy, a monogamous relationship, and her argument was, it is written in the Quran, so perhaps it's allowed, but also part of Islamic jurisprudence and Islamic ethics in general, Islamic theology, is to try to live an ethical life. And I cannot live an ethical life if I am in a polygamous relationship. And then she used this argument that okay, there are 5 different kinds of acts in Islamic theology. So certain things are obligatory, certain things are recommended, certain things are neutral, certain things are prohibited, and certain things are frowned upon but not prohibited, and it's fluid. It depends on the context. So some things that might be obligatory in other contexts might actually be, or recommended in some contexts, can be not prohibited from an ethical Islamic point of view. So for me, I think to make that explicit in our writing is extremely important to educate us about 2 things. First of all, about this person's life trajectory. This person also is very much activist, not in Islamic faith groups, but in anti-racist groups in Finland that forms alliances with the CeMig group there. They are marginalized. I think it's extremely interesting to make explicit how this religious meaning making is shifting, the kinds of arguments that she uses. I think that tells us something about theology. It makes the understanding about Sharia, Islam, theology much more rich. But then, to answer your question, and I haven't figured that out, I think, but and I tried to explain that recently, by the way, in this article that I co-wrote with my colleague, to explain that, not using this specific example, to make that, I think if journalists and policymakers, those who are afraid of Sharia or something, or understanding that law, if they can understand that, I think it opens up spaces for really talking about not only what Muslims need or how they live, but also about Islamic theology, and not looking at it as this fixed way, this something that invokes fear, and as also something that doesn't change and doesn't, but how do we do it? Maybe I'll share with you the article, because I tried to make that. I got some comments, mixed comments. Some comments that I got was, not for me, it was like, because I tried to explain to the public how, for example, people, when they marry in Finland now, Muslims, they marry Islamically, but they also register their marriages with the state, right? And Finland has a particular model of regulating religious pluralism, which is very interesting. We can talk about it if you like, which is, because mosques who are registered are given the right to solemnize religious marriages, and by solemnizing them, they also have the duty to register them in the notary, which unlike, for example, the Dutch system, where you can't have a religious marriage before you have a civil marriage. But back to your point, so I was trying to give the example of this journalist, and the conversation was this: our Minister of Justice there, that people are combining the two, are integrating the religious marriage and Islamic marriage and the civil marriage from an ethical perspective. Not everybody, but there are those who are getting there from a theological perspective and using theological arguments. So it's not simply like, oh, we live in a secular society, or therefore I have to register my marriage. It won't do simply that I marry Islamically. I find people who make these choices also interesting to bring about how they're changing. And I tried to make that case. Well, one person told me, this is in the editor's comments, was not happy, and said, you're just using this academic jargon, and because I said it's not just secular and religious, and all that stuff. What do you mean by that? They weren't happy, yeah, basically. So maybe I failed with that person, my colleagues and I. So I don't know. My answer would be, I think it would be interesting to make that visible, to communicate that, but how do we do it? That's something we can figure out. Yeah.
Sorry for that. Of organizing capitalism as the general framework through which people is expelled and dispossessed in the global thought. I mean, without that, I find hard to imagine a progressive ways of approaching the politics of migration.
Please do, yeah.
I was hoping you could elaborate on the point about the right not to migrate. Can you elaborate on that one?
Yeah. Yes. Yep.
Yeah, I actually, I mean that obviously I would not term it as progressive or that, but I mean that I would say that we're favoring migration. Yeah, I would use that term. And I think that this politics that should be based on present issues, not about past. And also often that people who actually supports migration, they also live in that some kind of taboo that they don't talk about some of the issues. And those spaces are actually, we say that occupied by people who are against migration. So we should be, all should be openly talking about all the issues that come out of migration. And so people who are actually supporting migration, and they should be also openly talking about those issues. Like any problem that's coming out of migration, people don't want to talk about that, So, and actually then there are other politicians, they are using those things and gaining popularity. So maybe that's the way to go forward.
Okay, yeah. Let me propose this. I saw one hand up in the back. Let's take a final question and then give each panelist a final statement, including the statement about right not to migrate. Yeah. Oh.
Thank you. Professor Garcia had a fourth question in regards to history and Thatcher and Reagan, and I was just wondering if you could give us a quick, what you wanted to say on that.
Okay, so that would be the last question. Carlos, why don't you start then?
Yeah, well, I take your point of pressing issues. Yeah, I agree that the present situation is quite important. But we can't approach the present situation without history. I think this is the starting point that I would like to go into detail, but there is no time. But I think what we have now can be understood without the specific historical formation. This is the first point. The second is regarding the right not to have to migrate. From my experience in Central America, most of the people who leave their countries would like to stay in their own communities. But now it's almost impossible to live in certain communities, for instance, in El Salvador, where the rate of murders is one of the highest worldwide. So the right not to have to migrate should be integrated in the research agendas of migration. And this implies to think about capabilities, opportunities, and just to use a common word, development, meaning, I don't know what, but overall development, well-being for most of the people. And regarding the Thatcher-Reagan couple, briefly, I would say that with the winning of the Tory party in 1979, if I'm not wrong, it was the beginning of this authoritarian populism, which was described, I think, in a very interesting way by Stuart Hall. And I think we have been living since then in this couple of neoliberal policies with new conservative approaches of culture. And the combination of neoliberal policies in the economy and new conservative views on culture has been quite persuasive. For me, the question is if in the last, let's say, 5 years, we are experiencing a shift in this authoritarian populism. So what is new is, for me, the question. Is only new chapters of the same story, or are we facing a new script in the ways in which migration, race, and other ways of exclusions are taking place? I hope I have the question, and I do hope to find some preliminary answer in the future.
What's your hunch?
It seems that it seems to me that something has changed in the sense that, just to quote an evidence, this authoritarian populism is now more prevalent in different political contexts. Eastern Europe is a case in point. Hungary, Poland, and other cases you know better than me. Yeah, well, it was present in the Reagan days. And also the very amazing situation in which previous socialist countries are now in the hands of the very right-wing governments. How to make sense of that? And even in Latin America, the Argentinian government is saying, well, part of the problem comes from migration. And the most sounding case is the Dominican Republic. They changed in the law, and they went from the now the Constitutional Court decided that children from undocumented migrants are no Dominican. So they return to the principles of ius sanguis, which is unique, at least in Latin America. So I could say they're shifts. These shifts are not for the good.
Yeah, but on this issue, I think there is hope. And we saw what happened to the ship that was in the Mediterranean Sea, where Italy didn't want them, no country wanted them, but you have now a progressive government in Spain. And the Prime Minister of Spain just said to them, what are you afraid of? I will take them. So there is hope somewhat in the horizon. When we have enlightened people who are in power, they can change things. And this is something that happened. He took power less than 2 weeks ago. And he took a decisive step to accept the ship, to accept the refugees. So there is hope. And when you have enlightened people, when you have people of good faith, then they can implement progressive policies in their country that respect the rights of people as people and not as with having some kind of identity that is artificially imposed on people to say, well, you are better than this one, and I'm going to treat you better than that one. And he's taking the refugees right now, and nobody else wanted them, right? And those are the things. And when in the case of history, you have to understand history's prologue. We can't understand the present if we don't study the past. So definitely we need to follow the trajectories of ideas, of decision-making processes of governments to understand why they are doing what they are doing today. Otherwise, you will be unable to comprehend what is happening in your own society or what may be happening to you as an individual in a society. So we cannot dismiss the past because we all construct, we all build on the past to comprehend our present and where we are going in the future.
I think maybe what we can take away, there's so many things we can take away, but one is what you were saying, Carlos, and you were alluding to, George. It's about also these global inequalities. So it's not just about immigrants and refugees in countries, receiving countries, but also why is life so marginalizing in sending countries? Why? And how could that be addressed? And they are linked to global inequalities, right? Very much so. So that's one point. And the other point, for history, I totally agree with you, because the point about the importance of studying history is because there are myths that are based because of a wrong or certain understanding of history or elision or erasure of certain history, and these myths shape current discourses. But I am hopeful. I am, and I'm hopeful, yeah, I am hopeful because as I was sitting there and I was listening to this young artist, singing, and very talented, and singing this Arabic song that I could understand, and so the Kurdish song that had some Arabic words, and also collaborating with his colleague, and how it spoke to all of us, I think. It really spoke to all of us. That made me hopeful. I don't know why. Really hopeful. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if this session has achieved nothing else than injecting hope, we should be hugely grateful for this panel. But I want to just end on that note. I think, you know, it's sort of mission accomplished. We've got lots of issues on the table, lots of challenges on the table that could be picked up over the next couple of days. And let me just, if you'll permit me, just 30 seconds, some lessons that I've learned, especially in terms of this burning question for me, which I've shared, you know, what is our role as researchers, as academics in this climate? And just 3 lessons I take away from this. What you were saying about educating, but what I would call kind of providing tools for complex thinking about it. As I say, you know, always we're usually not appreciated by media and politicians because we academics say it's always so complicated. But if we can help provide tools to allow others to think. So for instance, your example of these kind of 5 different modes of ethical thinking or choice within Islam, that's just an eye-opener when thinking about people's lives and fluidities and choices and so forth. And I would call those kind of tools for complex thinking. Another important lesson for our role is compelling narratives, like film. Film, you know, we can inject as many factoids and information and research findings out there, but if it's not packaged in a compelling narrative, we're not going to make that impact. So that's an important one. And finally, just an important lesson, what is our role? Stirring the pot. I think that was a great one. Stirring the pot can take many forms. Our evidence, our interjections, our motivation, participating, and as I think you were saying earlier, providing migrants themselves and kind of support groups with some background or information that they might find helpful as well as an important way of stirring the pot. So for me, I think that was also a great set of takeaways for me, and I'm sure we've got several other individual takeaways for that. So on that note, let's thank the panel for a great opening session.